What would you do if you heard someone screaming for help every night at exactly midnight? And when you finally discovered the source, you realized they'd been dead for over 70 years. Welcome to this journey into one of the most haunting acoustic mysteries in American history. But before we descend into these dark hollows, I need you to ask yourself, how long does suffering echo? Can pain become so profound that it literally carves itself into the landscape, replaying forever like a recording that cannot be stopped? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe the land itself can remember trauma. Because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about the boundary between the living and the dead, between scientific explanation and something far more disturbing. This content discusses real historical events involving loss of life and suffering. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered, died, and were left behind. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. If you're sensitive to discussions of death, suffering, or violence, please care for yourself first. In the Geological Survey records of Morgan County, West Virginia, there exists an acoustic anomaly that has never been fully explained, a sound phenomenon occurring on Screamer's Peak that has been documented, recorded, and studied by acoustics experts, yet defies every conventional explanation. Every night at precisely midnight, a human scream emanates from deep within the mountain itself. Not near it, not on it, from inside the rock itself, the sound has been measured, triangulated, recorded thousands of times, and it is identical, to the millisecond every single night. What you're about to discover is a mystery that begins with one man's greed, escalates into an entire community's complicity, and ends with a punishment so horrific that it literally became part of the mountain's geology, leaving a legacy so profound that science and superstition have been battling for decades to explain what cannot be denied. This isn't just history. This is a question about whether suffering can transcend death itself. It was the year 1946. World War II had ended. Soldiers were returning home to a nation celebrating victory, and America was drunk on the promise of prosperity. But in the remote mountains of West Virginia, in places where the hollows ran so deep that sunlight was a stranger and where coal was both salvation and curse, there were communities where the war's end meant nothing because their war, their struggle against the mountain and against each other, had never stopped. And in one of those forgotten places, something was about to happen that would prove that some screams never die. They just wait. The mountain had a name before it became Screamer's Peak, though no one remembers it now. The old maps, the ones yellowed and fragile in the Morgan County Historical Society, label it simply as Harlan's Rise, named for the Harlan family who first settled the eastern slope in 1863, refugees from a war that had turned Virginia into a graveyard. But names are fragile things in the mountains. They change, they adapt, they reflect what the land becomes, not what it was. And this mountain became a place of screaming. To understand what happened here, you need to understand the geography, not just of the land, but of isolation itself. Screamer's Peak rises 4,200 feet above sea level, a dark finger of ancient Appalachian rock composed primarily of limestone and shale, riddled with caves like a diseased lung. The hollows around its base are so narrow that even at noon, shadows pool in places where the sun hasn't penetrated in centuries. The trees, mostly eastern hemlock and black birch, grow in twisted configurations, their roots gripping rock where there should be no purchase, their branches reaching toward light that arrives only in brief, stingy intervals. But it's what's inside the mountain that matters. The limestone is porous, carved by underground streams that have been flowing since before humans walked these ridges. The cave systems are extensive, over 30 miles mapped, with countless passages remaining unexplored even today. The acoustics in these spaces are extraordinary. A whisper in one chamber can emerge from an opening half a mile away. Sound travels, bends, amplifies. The mountain is, in essence, a natural amplification system, a geological speaker. Remember that. We'll return to why that matters when the true horror becomes clear. The community of Harlan's Hollow, population 230, 7 in 1946, clung to the mountain's western slope like barnacles on a ship that would never reach port. It wasn't a town, not really. It was a collection of desperation. 43 families living in conditions that would have shocked even the poverty documentarians of the Depression era. No electricity, no running water. The nearest paved road was 11 miles away, accessible only by a trail that became impassable 6 months of the year. They survived on 3 things: coal, corn, and contempt for outsiders. The coal wasn't industrial. These weren't the massive operations that scared the landscape in other parts of West Virginia. These were drift mines, small, family-run operations where men crawled into the mountain with pickaxes and prayer, extracting just enough anthracite to trade for necessities in the valley town of Richter's Creek. Dangerous work, deadly work. In the decade before 1946, 7 men had died in cave-ins. One had simply never come out. They sealed his tunnel and called it his grave. The corn was for moonshine, primarily. The soil was too poor, the growing season too short for serious agriculture. But corn grew, barely, and what grew could be distilled into the white lightning that was the hollow's real currency. And the contempt, that was inherited, generational. These were people whose grandparents had fled civilization, who had chosen isolation over integration, who had developed their own rules, their own justice, their own way of surviving in a place that wanted them dead. Into this world, in the spring of 1946, came a man who would change everything. His name was Elias Greer. Elias Greer was not from the Hollow. That was his first sin in their eyes. He was what they called valley folk, educated, clean, fingered, possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from never having wondered where your next meal originates. He was 29 years old, a veteran of the Pacific Theater who'd returned from Okinawa with a Purple Heart, a limp from shrapnel that had shredded his left calf, and an idea that he believed would make him rich. The idea was simple: commercial cave tours. Greer had read about Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, about Luray Caverns in Virginia, natural wonders that attracted thousands of tourists willing to pay for the privilege of walking through underground chambers. He'd studied geology at West Virginia University before the war, and he knew that the cave systems beneath Harlan's Rise were potentially more spectacular than either of those famous sites. Larger chambers, more dramatic formations, untouched, unmapped, unexploited. He saw money, lots of it. The people of Harlan's Hollow saw something else, a threat. When Greer first arrived in late April of 1946, he came with government paperwork. The land, it turned out, wasn't owned by the families who'd lived on it for 3 generations. It was federal land, designated as such in some forgotten survey from the previous century. Greer had obtained mineral and tourism rights from the Department of Interior, legal, legitimate, completely meaningless to people who measured ownership in blood and sweat, not paper and stamps. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Greer told the informal council that gathered at the home of William Harlan, the eldest resident and de facto leader of the community. This meeting was recorded in Greer's own journal, a leather-bound volume discovered in 1998 that provides the only detailed account of his time in the Hollow. William Harlan was 71 years old, white-haired, leather-skinned, possessed of eyes that had seen things he'd never speak of. He sat in a rocking chair on his porch, a chair his grandfather had made from chestnut before the blight killed every chestnut tree in the mountains, and listened to Greer's proposal with the kind of patience a stone gives to wind. "You want to bring strangers here," Harlan finally said. It wasn't a question. "Tourists," Greer corrected. "People who would pay to see the caves. It would bring money to the area, jobs. I'd need local guides, maintenance workers. This could transform the hollow." Transform. Harlan tested the word like it was something foul. "We don't want transforming, Mr. Greer. We want to be left alone." But Greer had the law on his side, and he was determined. He set up a base camp at the mountain's northern face, where the largest known cave entrance yawned like a mouth frozen mid-scream. He began surveying, mapping, taking photographs. He brought equipment, ropes, lamps, surveying tools. He worked alone, mostly, though occasionally he hired day labor from the hollow for heavy lifting. One of those hired hands was a young man named Thomas Harlan, William's grandson. 17 years old, curious about the world beyond the hollow in the way young men always are. Thomas began to talk with Greer, to ask questions, to imagine a life different from the one the mountain offered. This was Elias Greer's second sin. You're probably thinking you know where this story goes. Young man corrupted by outsider. Community outrage, violence. Keep that thought, we're going to shatter it. The caves beneath Harlan's rise are not beautiful in the conventional sense. They lack the delicate formations found in tourist caves, the graceful stalactites, the flowing stone draperies. Instead, they are harsh, angular. The walls are sharp limestone, fractured and refractured by geological violence. The passages are irregular, some so vast you cannot see the ceiling with a lamp, others so constricted you must exhale to squeeze through. But there is one chamber, the one Greer discovered in June of 1946, that defies description. He called it the Echo Cathedral in his journal. According to his measurements, the chamber was roughly 160 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 90 feet high at its apex. But what made it extraordinary was its acoustic properties. Greer discovered, quite by accident, that sound behaved strangely in this space. A handclap would return not as a simple echo, but as a complex reverberation that seemed to come from multiple directions. Stranger still, the echoes would sometimes continue for up to 30 seconds, far longer than the physics of simple reflection should allow. He documented this carefully, scientifically. He noted that the effect was strongest at the chamber's center, where a natural rock formation rose from the floor like a pulpit. He noted that certain frequencies seemed to be amplified while others were dampened. He noted that the chamber was connected by a series of smaller passages to at least 12 other cavities, creating what he believed was a natural acoustic network. This chamber alone, he wrote in his journal, could be the centerpiece of a world-class attraction. The acoustic phenomenon is unlike anything I've encountered in geological literature. I believe with proper study, this could revolutionize our understanding of natural sound propagation. He was right, and he was catastrophically wrong about what he'd found. On June 23, 1946, Greer made a discovery that excited him beyond measure. In exploring a narrow passage that branched off from the Echo Cathedral, he found evidence of human presence, ancient human presence. Petroglyphs carved into the limestone, symbols he couldn't decipher, and something else, bones. They were old, very old, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual. Greer wasn't an archaeologist, but he knew enough to understand he'd found something significant. This wasn't just a cave, it was a sacred site. Indigenous peoples, likely the Shawnee who had inhabited these mountains before being driven out, had used this place for purposes he could only guess at. He should have stopped, should have reported the find, should have understood that some places demand respect, not exploitation. Instead, he began planning how to incorporate the archaeological discovery into his cave tour narrative. This was his third sin, and it would be his last, but let's pause here. Let's talk about what we think we know, and what the evidence actually shows. The standard narrative about Appalachian communities is one of superstition, of ignorance, of violence lurking beneath a veneer of hospitality. It's a narrative that has been sold and re-sold, from pulp fiction to documentary films, and it's not entirely false. But it's not entirely true either. The people of Harlan's Hollow were not ignorant. They were isolated, yes. Uneducated by formal standards, certainly. But they possessed knowledge that Elias Greer, with his university degree and his government papers, lacked entirely. They knew the mountain. They knew its moods, its dangers, its rules. They knew which caves were safe and which were wrong, a word they used to describe places where people disappeared, where sounds behaved strangely, where the very air felt hostile. They knew that the Echo Cathedral, though they didn't call it, that was a place you didn't enter unless you wanted to invite trouble. They had their reasons built on 3 generations of experience. In 1870, a hunting party had entered the cave system, and only 2 of the 5 men had emerged. The survivors spoke of sounds, voices calling their names from passages that led nowhere, laughter echoing from chambers where no one stood. The 3 who didn't return were never found. In 1909, a young couple had used one of the cave entrances for privacy, as young couples will. The woman had emerged alone, hysterical, speaking of her lover being taken by the mountain. When they found his body 3 days later in a passage half a mile from where she claimed he'd disappeared, the official cause of death was listed as misadventure. But the woman insisted, for the rest of her life, that she'd heard him screaming from inside the walls themselves. In 1934, during a particularly harsh winter, several families had sheltered in the larger caves to escape a blizzard. They emerged speaking of sounds, a rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat, that seemed to come from deep within the mountain. One child, a girl of 7, had wandered away from the group. They found her standing at the entrance to the Echo Cathedral, unresponsive, her eyes fixed on something they couldn't see. She never spoke again. These stories weren't superstition. They were data points, warning signs, the community's way of saying, this place is dangerous in ways you cannot understand. Elias Greer heard these stories. Thomas Harlan told him, enthusiastically, the way young people tell ghost stories, for entertainment, not warning. And Greer did what educated people often do when confronted with local wisdom. He dismissed it. Acoustic anomalies, he told Thomas. The passages create natural sound channels. Voices carry in unexpected ways. Add darkness, fear, unfamiliarity, and the human mind fills in the gaps. There's a rational explanation for everything. He was half right. There are acoustic anomalies. Sound does behave strangely in those caves, but rational explanation and complete explanation are not the same thing. The confrontation came on July 4, 1946, Independence Day. The Hollow didn't celebrate the holiday. Patriotism was a luxury for people who had enough to eat. But Greer had declared it a day off from his survey work. Instead, he'd hiked down to Richter's Creek to mail letters and purchase supplies. When he returned that evening, he found the entrance to his base camp destroyed. Someone had collapsed the rock face using black powder, crude but effective. Tons of limestone blocked the cave entrance. His equipment, his notes, his photographs, everything inside was buried. Weeks of work erased. According to his journal, Greer's first emotion was disbelief. His second was rage. He stormed to William Harlan's home and demanded answers. A crowd gathered. In a community of 237 people, everything is everyone's business. The confrontation was witnessed by at least 30 people, and testimony from the subsequent investigation gives us multiple accounts of what was said. "You had no right," Greer shouted, "that's federal property. I have legal authority. You've destroyed months of work." William Harlan remained seated in his rocking chair. "You were warned," he said simply, "warned. You gave me folklore and superstition. We gave you knowledge. You chose ignorance. I'll have you arrested, all of you. This is sabotage, destruction of property, criminal trespass. This is our mountain." Harlan interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that silenced Greer. "Has been for 80 years, will be for 80 more after your dust. The law says it's yours. The mountain says different. Here's where the accounts diverge." Some witnesses claimed Greer threatened the community, spoke of bringing state police, of having them all removed from land they'd occupied for generations. Others said he simply demanded compensation. One account claims he raised his hand as if to strike the old man, though no one agrees that he actually did. What everyone agrees on is what Thomas Harlan did next. The young man stepped forward from the crowd. "I'll help you," he said to Greer. "I'll show you another entrance, larger than the one they collapsed, and I'll testify that they sabotaged your work." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, Thomas Harlan crossed a line that communities like this drew clearly and enforced ruthlessly. You do not side with outsiders against your own. Ever, for any reason, Thomas, his grandfather, said, "Come here." "No." The young man's voice trembled but held firm. "You're wrong, all of you. There's nothing evil in those caves. There's opportunity. Mr. Greer is offering us a chance at something better, and you're too afraid to take it." "We're afraid of what we know," Harlan replied. "You're brave about what you don't." But Thomas had made his choice. He left with Greer that night, carrying his few possessions, burning every bridge behind him. The community considered him dead from that moment forward. What happened next defies all logical explanation, and we have 3 conflicting witness accounts, each more disturbing than the last. According to Elias Greer's journal, the final entries, written in increasingly unsteady handwriting, Thomas led him to a different entrance on the mountain's eastern face. Larger, as promised, more accessible, they set up a new camp. They began mapping a different route to the Echo Cathedral. The work went quickly, too quickly, Greer noted. Thomas seemed driven by something beyond enthusiasm, as if he were racing against an invisible deadline. They worked 12, 14 hours a day, pushing deeper into the cave system, establishing the route Greer would eventually use for tours. On July 18th, 2 weeks after leaving his family, Thomas led Greer into the Echo Cathedral itself. This is where Greer's journal entries become strange. "The acoustics are wrong today," he wrote. Or perhaps they've always been wrong, and I'm only now hearing it correctly. Thomas spoke his name aloud, testing the echo as we've done 100 times before. But what came back wasn't his voice. It was voices, plural, calling his name, from directions that shouldn't exist. The entry continues. "Thomas insists we leave, says the mountain is angry. I reminded him that mountains don't have emotions. They're geological formations, nothing more. But even as I said it, I heard it too, not words, just a sound like breathing, like something vast and patient drawing breath." The next entry is dated July 20th. Thomas won't enter the cathedral anymore. Says he hears his grandfather's voice calling him back. says the mountain is telling him he's made a terrible mistake. I work alone now. The formations are remarkable, but the sound is becoming difficult to ignore. At night, in my tent, I hear echoes from deep in the mountain. Echoes of nothing. Echoes of silence itself. July 22nd, I found the center point today, the exact acoustic focal point of the cathedral. There's a natural depression in the rock floor, perfectly circular, approximately 3 feet in diameter. When I stood in it and spoke, my voice returned to me amplified tenfold, but distorted, almost unrecognizable, as if the mountain were mocking me, as if it were learning my voice to use against me. July 24th, Thomas is gone, left in the night without a word. I should follow. Every instinct I possess screams at me to leave this place, but I'm so close to understanding. Acoustic properties of this chamber are unlike anything in geological literature. I believe, and I know this will sound insane, I believe the chamber is designed, not by humans, by something else, by time itself, perhaps, by forces we don't understand. The indigenous peoples knew. That's why they used this place, not for shelter, for something else, for listening, for speaking to something that speaks back. That was his final entry. On July 26, 1946, Thomas Harlan returned to the hollow. He was carrying Elias Greer's journal. His clothes were torn, his hands bloody, his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare that soldiers brought back from war. He went directly to his grandfather's house. What he said there, in private, has never been officially recorded. But within 2 hours, 12 men from the hollow, the strongest, the most respected, the ones whose word carried weight, had gathered at William Harlan's home. They left carrying ropes, lamps, and tools. They were gone for 3 days. When they returned, none of them would speak about what they'd done. Not to the women, not to the children, not to anyone outside their group of 12. But Thomas Harlan spoke. Once, to his mother, Sarah Harlan, who recorded his words in a letter to her sister. A letter not discovered until 2011. "We found him," Thomas said, "in the cathedral, in the center where the sound is strongest. He'd been experimenting, trying to understand the acoustics. He'd brought rope, had tied one end around his waist and the other to a rock formation. Said he wanted to map the sound properties from different positions." The letter continues with Thomas's words, "Something happened. He must have fallen. The rope got tangled. He was hanging there, suspended over the center point. Still alive when we found him, but wrong, Mama, he was wrong. His face was, I can't describe it. Terror beyond anything I've seen, and the sound he was making. It wasn't screaming, not exactly. It was his voice, but amplified, distorted, echoing back from every surface until it became something else entirely. A sound that shouldn't come from a human throat. We tried to get him down, we did try, but the rope. Something was wrong with the rope. Every time we touched it, the echoes got worse. The whole chamber started resonating, and Greer, he was screaming words we couldn't understand, and those words were coming back at us from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, all around us. That's when Grandfather made the decision. He said some places don't let go. He said Greer had tied himself to the mountain's voice, and the only way to silence it was to give the mountain what it wanted. He said it was mercy. They cut the rope, Mama. They cut it, and Greer fell into that depression in the stone, and the sound, God above the sound, it wasn't just his screaming. It was every scream that chamber had ever heard, all at once, all layered together into something that made my ears bleed. And then Grandfather and the others did something I still don't understand. They had black powder, the same they'd used to collapse the first entrance, but they didn't use it to blast. They used it to seal. They found crevices in the chamber walls, natural fissures, and they packed them with powder and limestone dust and something else, something Grandfather had brought from home. Plants, maybe. Roots, I don't know. When they lit the fuses and we ran, the explosion wasn't normal. It didn't sound like rock breaking. It sounded like a door slamming shut. And when the dust settled and we went back in, the echo cathedral had changed, the acoustics were different, and from the center point, from where Greer had fallen, the letter ends there. Whatever Thomas was about to say, he either couldn't write it or his mother chose not to record it. But we know what happened next because it couldn't be hidden. On July 29, 1946, Elias Greer was reported missing by his family in Richter's Creek. They'd received no letters. He'd missed a scheduled telephone call. His father, a prominent attorney, immediately contacted state authorities. The investigation was led by Sheriff Harland Price, no relation to the Harlan family, despite the similar name. Price was a the book lawman, 50, 3 years old, a veteran of the First World War, not easily impressed or intimidated. His investigation report, preserved in the Morgan County Archives, makes for fascinating and frustrating reading. Price and 2 deputies arrived in Harlan's Hollow on August 1st. They were met with what the sheriff described as complete cooperation and complete uselessness. Everyone answered his questions. No one told him anything useful. Had they seen Elias Greer? Yes, several times in early July. Did they know where he'd gone? Into the caves, they assumed. That's what he did. Did anyone know which entrance? Could have been several. The mountain has many mouths. Had anyone assisted him? Thomas Harlan had, briefly, but Thomas had returned and Greer had not. Did Thomas know where Greer was now? No. Would Thomas show them the cave entrance? No. Why not? Because the mountain took him, and what the mountain takes, it keeps. That answer appears 3 times in Price's report, from 3 different witnesses, using nearly identical words. The sheriff searched anyway. His deputies found Greer's abandoned camp at the eastern entrance. They found equipment, supplies, everything except Greer himself and his journal. They entered the cave system, but quickly became disoriented in the maze of passages. Price requisitioned help from the State Mining Commission, experienced cave explorers who arrived on August 5th with proper equipment and maps. They spent 6 days searching the accessible portions of the cave system. They found nothing, but they heard something. This is documented. This is not legend. 4 experienced cave explorers, all with backgrounds in mining and geology, all signed statements confirming what they heard. On August 9th, at approximately 11:47 p.m., while camped in a large chamber roughly 1 mile from the eastern entrance, they heard a scream. It was distant. It was human. And it repeated. Every report describes it slightly differently. One called it anguished, another terrified, a third inhuman despite being clearly a human voice. But all 4 agreed on 2 details. First, the scream seemed to come from inside the rock itself, not from a passage or chamber, but from the solid limestone. Second, it occurred at exactly midnight. They heard it again the following night. Same time, same sound. By the 3rd night, they'd brought recording equipment primitive by modern standards, but functional. They captured it. The recording still exists in the state archives, digitized in 1999. I've heard it. If you search online, you can hear it too. 3 seconds of audio, a man's voice screaming. The sound quality is poor, lots of static, lots of distortion, but it's there, undeniable, real. The explorers concluded their report with a recommendation that the cave system be sealed for public safety, not because of Greer's disappearance, but because of unexplained acoustic phenomena that present psychological hazards to personnel. Sheriff Price's final report is more direct. It is the conclusion of this office that Elias Greer died by misadventure in the cave system beneath Harlan's Rise. The exact location and circumstances of his death cannot be determined. The acoustic phenomena reported by the State Mining Commission personnel are noted, but cannot be explained by this office. No evidence of foul play has been discovered. Case closed, except it wasn't closed because the screaming didn't stop. Every night at midnight, without fail. It started almost immediately after the investigation ended. Residents of Harlan's Hollow reported hearing the scream, those closest to the mountain most clearly, but even those in the furthest cabins could hear it faintly, carried on the wind like a promise of suffering. At first, people tried to ignore it. Then they tried to explain it. Wind through the caves. Animals, acoustic tricks, anything but what they knew in their bones it actually was. By September, families started leaving. Not all at once. That would have required more organization than the hollow possessed, but gradually. One family would pack up and move to Richter's Creek or beyond, then another, then another. William Harlan stayed. So did Thomas and his mother. So did about 30 others, the ones too stubborn or too poor or too connected to the land to abandon it. They learned to live with the screaming. You get used to it. Thomas Harlan said in an interview conducted in 1968 by a folklore researcher from West Virginia University. Like living near a train track. First week, you notice every time. After a month, you barely hear it. After a year, you'd miss it if it stopped. But it never stopped. Not when the hollow's population dwindled to 20. Not when electricity finally arrived in 1953. Not when the last family left in 1967, leaving only Thomas Harlan, by then a hollow-eyed man in his late 30s, living alone in his grandfather's abandoned house. The scream continued, documented, recorded, studied. In 1970, a team of acoustics engineers from MIT arrived with the latest equipment. They spent 2 weeks taking measurements, mapping sound propagation, analyzing frequencies. Their published paper, Anomalous Acoustic Phenomena in Limestone Cave Systems, a case study of Harlan's rise, West Virginia, concluded that the scream was real, measurable, and inexplicable by known acoustic principles. The sound appeared to originate from inside solid rock, not from any accessible chamber. It occurred at exactly midnight, with temporal precision that exceeded their equipment's ability to measure. It was identical from night to night, the same frequency distribution, the same duration, 2.7 seconds, the same amplitude pattern. If this is a recording, the lead researcher wrote, it's being played by a mechanism we cannot identify, triggered by a timing system more accurate than atomic clocks, emanating from a speaker embedded in limestone. If it's not a recording, then we are observing a phenomenon that violates our understanding of sound propagation and temporal consistency. In 1983, the mountain was sold to a private development company with plans to turn the area into a resort. The screaming killed those plans within a month. No amount of marketing could overcome the simple fact that a human voice screamed in agony every night at midnight. In 1997, a group of paranormal investigators, the first of many, arrived with equipment designed to detect electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, and other supposed signs of supernatural activity. They found nothing unusual, just the scream, always the scream. In 2003, ground-penetrating radar technology had advanced enough to map the cave system without human entry. A team from the USCs created a detailed three-dimensional model of every accessible chamber, every passage, every geological feature. They found the Echo Cathedral, they found the center point, and they found something else. The limestone surrounding that center point, in a sphere roughly 30 feet in diameter, had a different density than the rest of the cave system. Not dramatically different, not obviously different, but measurably different, as if the rock itself had been compressed, or altered, or fundamentally changed by something that had occurred there. In 2011, when Sarah Harlan's letter was discovered and made public, journalists descended on what remained of Harlan's Hollow. They found Thomas Harlan's grave. He died in 2009, alone, the last resident of a dead community. They found the ruins of 43 homes, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. They found the eastern cave entrance, partially collapsed but still accessible. And they heard the scream. Some of those journalists were skeptics, hardened professionals who'd built careers on debunking nonsense. They came with expensive audio equipment, with thermal cameras, with every tool modern technology could provide. They all heard it, they all recorded it, and none of them could explain it. One journalist, Rachel Morrison from the Washington Post, wrote an article that captured what everyone who'd investigated felt. Science tells us that what we're hearing is impossible. Every law of physics we understand says that sound cannot behave this way, cannot originate from solid rock, cannot repeat with such precision, cannot remain unchanged for decades. But science also tells us to believe our instruments, and our instruments say the scream is real. So we're left with a choice: accept that our understanding of physics is incomplete, or accept that some phenomena exist outside the boundaries of natural law. Either option is terrifying, but there was one more truth waiting to surface. In 2019, a graduate student in geology from West Virginia University decided to make screamers pique the subject of her doctoral thesis. Her name was Dr. Jennifer Park, and she approached the mystery from a different angle than anyone before. Instead of focusing on the scream itself, she studied the rock. Using advanced spectrographic analysis, a technique that can identify mineral composition and crystalline structure at microscopic levels, she examined samples of the limestone from multiple locations in the cave system, including samples from the area around the center point of the Echo Cathedral. What she found changed everything. The limestone around the center point contained traces of organic material, not ancient organic material, like the fossils commonly found in limestone. Recent organic material, carbon, dated to approximately 1946, human remains, tissue, bone, blood, all of it distributed through the limestone matrix as if it had been absorbed, incorporated, made part of the rock itself. Dr. Park's findings were published in the Journal of Cave and Karst Studies in 2021. Her conclusion was cautiously worded. The evidence suggests that human biological material became integrated with the limestone through a process that current geological science cannot explain. Distribution pattern indicates rapid absorption rather than gradual fossilization. The mechanism remains unknown. But in interviews, she was more direct. Something happened in that chamber, something violent enough, traumatic enough, that it left a biological signature in solid rock. And somehow, that signature is still active, still broadcasting. You might think the story ends here. You would be wrong, because in 2022, for the first time in 76 years, the scream changed. On March 15, 2022, at exactly midnight, the scream that had been identical for 7 decades suddenly included words. Not at first. For the first 2 seconds, it was the same as always. But in the final point, 7 seconds, multiple witnesses reported hearing actual words. The audio recordings confirm it, though the words are distorted, compressed, overlapping. Still here, help, please, still. The local news covered it. Then regional news, then national. Screamer's Peak became a viral phenomenon. Thousands of people made pilgrimages to hear it. The small parking area at the base of the mountain became a nightly gathering place for curiosity seekers, TikTok content creators, paranormal enthusiasts, and people who simply needed to hear it with their own ears. Most heard just the scream, but some, particularly those who stood closest to the mountain, who pressed their hands against the rock face, who opened themselves to the experience rather than approaching it as spectacle, they heard more. They heard pleading, they heard agony that had not diminished with time. They heard a man who had died 76 years ago but had never stopped dying. In April of 2022, a petition was started to attempt an excavation, to somehow reach the center point, to recover whatever remains might still be there, to end the screaming by giving Elias Greer a proper burial. The state of West Virginia denied the petition. Too dangerous, too expensive, too disruptive to a sensitive geological area. But there was another reason, one stated privately by the state geologist who reviewed the proposal. We don't know what's keeping him there. We don't know what mechanism, natural or otherwise, had preserved his consciousness in that stone, and we don't know what would happen if we disrupted it. The scream is horrific, yes, but at least it's contained. At least it's predictable. If we dig into that chamber, we might release something far worse. The screaming continues, every night, exactly at midnight. Sometimes just the sound, sometimes with words, always with the same core of anguish that has echoed through that mountain for 3/4 of a century. The story of Screamer's Peak remains unsettling, not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the boundaries between the living and the dead, between punishment and eternity, between human suffering and geological time. Elias Greer entered a mountain seeking fortune and found something else entirely. 12 men from Harlan's Hollow made a decision that night, a decision they believed was mercy, necessity, justice. And in making that decision, they created something that has outlived them all, a testament to suffering that cannot end, a voice that cannot be silenced, a scream that has become part of the mountain itself. But questions remain, questions that haunt every investigator who has stood at the base of that mountain and listened to midnight approach. Did Greer die in that chamber, or is he somehow still dying, trapped in a moment of agony that repeats forever? Did the 12 men know what they were doing when they sealed that chamber? Or did they accidentally create a prison from which death itself cannot provide escape? And perhaps most disturbing, how many other places exist where suffering has carved itself so deeply into the earth that it echoes forward through time, waiting to be discovered? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the punishment we deserve for our certainty that death ends all suffering. To this day, the area around Screamer's Peak is largely abandoned. The forest has reclaimed Harlan's Hollow, reducing it to foundation stones and memory. But every night, researchers monitor the phenomenon. Audio equipment records every scream. Scientists study the data, searching for patterns, for explanations, for any clue that might unlock this mystery. And every night, at exactly midnight, Elias Greer screams. The sound carries for miles on still nights. Local residents, those few who remain in the scattered communities around the mountain, barely notice it anymore. It's become part of the soundscape, as natural as wind or rain or the distant rumble of thunder. But visitors notice. They stand in parking lots and along ridge lines, their phones recording, their faces reflecting the same mix of fascination and horror that has drawn humans to darkness since we first learned to fear it. And on silent nights in the mountains of West Virginia, when the air is still and the stars shine cold and indifferent above, when you press your ear against ancient stone and listen, really listen, you might hear more than just screaming. You might hear the mountain itself, breathing, remembering, holding tight to what it has claimed. Most dismiss it as imagination, as the mind playing tricks in darkness, as the human tendency to find patterns in chaos. But some know better. If this journey through the dark heart of Appalachia resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering whether suffering can transcend death itself, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about human nature, about justice and mercy, about the price we pay for certainty. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question the boundary between the natural and the impossible, between death and eternity. And in the comments, I want to know, was what the 12 men did murder, or was it mercy? If you'd found Elias Greer in that chamber, trapped in agony, would you have tried to save him, or would you have made the same terrible choice? And knowing what we know now, that he screams still, that death brought no release, does that change your answer? Would you have tried to help him? Would you have sealed him in that darkness? Or, like most people faced with horror beyond comprehension, would you have simply looked away and pretended you hadn't seen? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to confront the limits of our compassion, our understanding, our certainty that we know where life ends and death begins, and sometimes the darkness we fear isn't in the mountain. It's in the choices we make when we believe no one will ever know. But the mountain knows. The mountain always knows, and it never forgets.